The world is changing. For decades, the power rested in the hands of a few.
There's a new-ish term that everyone seems to be using, Global South. Think of it as the new developing world.
These countries are stepping onto the global stage, developing a voice. The question is, can they reshape the global power dynamics? Today, we'll explore how emerging countries in the global south are transforming geopolitics, the tools they're using, and the challenges they face. Based on Stefan Kleinberg's insights, we'll analyze this dynamic story. To understand this change, let's rewind. For most of history, the global north led the world as the dominant power. But in the first century, the global south declared,
"We don't need the West. The West is not honest at all. They don't give, they only take."
中国欢迎一切善意的这种建议，但是我们拒绝任何无端的指责。
Of course, there are people who say, well, we give you our money, so we must tell you what to do and what to be. Well, there comes a point where you say, okay, between my rights and what I want to be and your money, you can have your money.
The change, I think, is many countries in the global south today have the agency to make a difference. Many of them see that the international system does not give them the kind of respect and weight in the international institutions. So they all have a stake in making greater demands on the international system.
they wanted a say in global decisions and to be seen as equal players on the world stage. Countries like China and India now demand leadership roles. Initiatives like China's Belt and Road reshape global infrastructure. Regional alliances such as BRICS amplify the voices of the Global South has also gained momentum through voting patterns at the UN and participation in major climate and development summits. The Global South is no longer just following, it's leading. Countries in the Global South use a mix of tools to assert their power on the global stage. Let's look at three key mechanisms. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank reflect the dominance of the Global North.
So America donates the most money, so it always gets to choose where that money gets allocated to some extent. And there are criticisms that America tends to favor refugee crises in areas that it has interests in.
But the Global South is creating alternatives. The new development bank, China's Belt and Road Initiative, links 180 countries with infrastructure projects, creating strong economic dependencies.
I'm not shocked by hypocrisy, because hypocrisy is part of life, and I think all states, it's not just the West. China does its own hypocrisy.
Analysed 100 Chinese contracts, it revealed that the loans are structured to give an advantage over other creditors and allows action to be taken if the borrower acts contrary to the interests of a People's Republic of China entity. There are also unusual clauses that shroud agreements in secrecy.
Alliances like BRICS and G77 give these countries collective strength in negotiations and UN votes. These tools are powerful, but they come with challenges. Let's look at the obstacles that stand in the way of true global power redistribution. Regardless of how hard they keep working to make a change, the Global South still faces serious struggles. The world is divided between the Global North and South, making cooperation on major issues like climate change difficult. Many Global South countries rely on aid and loans from the Global North or China, which creates new vulnerabilities.
And then there's also the fact that countries in debt crises, so Sri Lanka or in Egypt, for example, they access capital at much higher interest rates. And then when they turn to the IMF, they usually only get help if they impose very tough austerity measures. Meanwhile, rich Western countries often have much better access to capital. Is that part of this equation as well, of things that the Global South tends to be unhappy about but wants better terms of engagement from the rich Western countries or Global North? There's a real danger to lumping together all these countries and acting as if they speak with one voice. They don't.
The Global South isn't a single group. Pacific Island nations need urgent climate action.
Sometimes very hot. Rain never never fall with too much sun, too much hot.
While oil economies like Saudi Arabia focus on energy exports, does the Global South really influence global power? The big countries were never truly interested in the well-being of foreign nations. Instead, their motives have often been driven by personal interests such as securing energy resources or raw materials. These dominant powers have historically manipulated and taken advantage of Global South countries at their most vulnerable moments. For instance, look at the ongoing conflict in Africa. The war in Congo is fueled by rich countries funding weapons for rebel groups, destabilizing the government while benefiting from the nation's natural resources.
Congo has a very, very significant mining industry. It's Africa's biggest producer of copper. It's by far the world's biggest producer of cobalt. Cobalt is a key ingredient in the rechargeable batteries that power electric vehicles. You hear politicians talk about Congo saying that we are to cobalt as Saudi Arabia is to oil. However, up until now, at least, the benefits to government revenue and the benefits to the population at large have been rather limited.
Each of these countries feel like they're being put in a place where their needs are sometimes seen as subservient as those of the West. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say during the pandemic, the reluctance of countries that were producing vaccines to actually supply them, a lot of vaccines were being wasted in the countries which could afford them rather than being delivered to countries that needed them. And the economic impact of COVID and the lack of support, that magnified it. And then you have conservatives like President Trump. He called them shithole countries, if you recall. There is this sense that, look, we don't care for this part of the world. But on the liberal side as well, in the West, there is a deep condescension that has taken hold since the end of the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, you needed a lot of these countries. So there were people who were willing to engage them for whatever reasons, for strategic and other purposes. But after 91, the sense you did not really need them. It was really up to these countries to measure up to the standards of either Washington Consensus or the new human rights standards. So it really seemed that they're always up there to be judged rather than engaged as partners in any meaningful sense.
Similarly, Libya, once a promising developing nation under
thanks to his regime's rollout of a wave of nationalizations in the oil industry, which would see Libya become the first developing country to secure a majority stake in its own oil revenues. The Gaddafi regime would make significant investments into the country's infrastructure and greatly improve its healthcare and education systems. Thousands of acres of land which were owned by foreigners and members of the old royal family would be seized and redistributed to local farmers who would be provided with government salaries until the farms became profitable. The government would also subsidize the construction of public housing for many of Libya's poor. And during the course of Gaddafi's reign, Libya's overall literacy rate would rise from 10% to 88%, while its life expectancy would rise from 57 to 74, and its infant mortality rate would fall from an African average of 125 deaths per 1,000 live births to 15 deaths per 1,000 live births. In the year before Gaddafi's death, Libya's estimated GDP per capita of $12,062 would be the highest in all of Africa, as Libya would also be ranked as the only African country with a high Human Development Score in the 2010 Human Development Index, posting a better score than Russia and China, as well as Eastern European countries such as Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, and Serbia. Unlike virtually every other African country, Gaddafi's Libya was financially self-sufficient and not indebted to any international banks or financial institutions. His regime would also embark on a number of groundbreaking infrastructure projects, the most prominent of which would be the world's largest irrigation system, known as the Great Man-Made River. This $25 billion irrigation project would be developed to move fresh water across Libya's dry lands through a 4,000-kilometer network of water pipes.
Has struggled to recover since Western interventions overthrew its leadership. These patterns reveal that major powers only engage with the Global South when it serves their own interests, and when the things spiral out of control, they turn a blind eye, allowing innocent people to suffer.
Things are expensive and people have no money in their pockets. Life is real tough, and that's that. Many places in Tripoli have 5 to 6 hours of power outages every day.
Today, everyone wants to be friends with the Global South because they have become crucial in world politics. But these nations are not naive. They understand these geopolitical games. That's why many refuse to take sides between the US and China, striving instead for independent growth and decision making. The competition between the US/Europe and China over influence in the Global South raises concerns because it is not necessarily about genuinely helping these nations. It is about strategic positioning. China's goal is influence.
It also gave China much needed political allies.
Beijing said, "We have problems, you have problems, we will help you out."
While Eastern nations seem driven by personal gain.
The things you see in Africa is that so much of the railways and the highways and the infrastructure was built during the colonial period. And back then it was quite solid, but it's been decrepit because the former colonial governments are not plowing in lots of money.
Take the Belt and Road Initiative as an example. Rwanda has significantly benefited from Chinese infrastructure projects. According to the News Times, these projects have played a key role in Rwanda's development and fostered a mutually beneficial relationship. I firmly believe that the Global South is influencing global power.
Nous l'avons laissé pour que les gens qui viennent visiter la ville viennent regarder ce que les Américains ont fait comme vandalisme, terrorisme, qu'ils puissent apprendre et voir ce que les Américains ont fait ici chez nous. C'était la nuit du 14 avril 1986.
These nations are making their voices heard, defending their interests and rejecting outdated systems that serve only the global north. Take Burkina Faso and other African nations breaking away from French influence because they recognize that France does not have their best interests at heart.
Il a aussi insulté tous les Africains.
Je crois qu'on a oublié de nous dire merci. C'est pas grave, ça viendra avec le temps.
Il y a une partie qui a retenu mon attention, là où il parlait d'ingratitude.
L'ingratitude, je suis bien placé pour le savoir, c'est une maladie non transmissible à l'homme.
Lui, il est humain, notre ingratitude n'est pas transmissible à lui. Voilà comment ce monsieur voit l'Afrique, voit les Africains. Nous ne sommes pas des humains à ses yeux.
Africa is less economically dependent on France than it once was, and in many ways, France is now more dependent on Africa, given that it imports a significant fraction of both its oil and uranium from Africa.
Ideally, powerful nations should be more honest and transparent about their true motives, whether their involvement is for personal gain or to genuinely assist those in need. The Global South seeks to work in a way that promotes trust, fairness, and mutual benefit for all parties involved.